Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel. I'm reading this year's Booker Prize longlist, and in this video I've got reviews of 4 of the books that have been nominated for the 2025 edition of the prize. So let's dive right into those. I started off my reading for this year's prize with The Rest of Our Lives by Ben Markovits. He is a name I recognise not just because he's a Ben, but he's been quite a prolific author. He's written quite a few novels, but I'd never actually read him before, so I was keen to give this a go. And this one isn't too long, so it felt a good place to start with the list. This story follows a man called Tom, whose wife cheated on him years ago. When this happened, their daughter Miriam was still a child, and Tom quietly decided that he'd stay until she left for college, and at that point he'd leave too. That's not a spoiler, it's all on page 1. And we meet Tom just before he is driving Miri to college for the very first time. What should be a straightforward drop-off turns into a much longer road trip, as he then just keeps going and he sees friends and family and even an old flame. Along the way, he tries to make sense of that promise he made to himself as a younger man and what his life is for. Has he wasted it? And what meaning does it have now that he has an empty nest? There are 2 subplots that run alongside this main sort of journey narrative. First, Tom half-heartedly restarts working on this book idea that's been gestating in his mind for a long time, where he goes and plays pick-up basketball with strangers and then writes about them based on what he learns on the court. Second, he is dealing with some health issues that everyone he meets keeps telling him to go and get checked out, but he waves them off and says it's just part of getting older. It's something that he's already spoken to a doctor about. He's had tests, they've come back with nothing to indicate that there's anything wrong, but still he's waking up with a swollen face and his eyes are watering. He's got some weird bruises on his chest that he can't explain, and all of that is broad strokes what this book is. But what did I think of it? Well, I really enjoyed it. I think the prose is breezy, but it has this quiet elegance to it. And Markovits has a knack for letting the big ideas emerge in small throwaway moments, all of which build up to create this picture of these characters and the lives they lead. There's a line early on in the book where Tom is walking along the beach with his daughter and he says to her, "People repeat themselves when they're trying to work something out." That, to me, is this novel in a nutshell. It's a man circling back over his life, jumping back through his own footprints and turning things over and over, hoping that some truth and meaning will emerge. I think the health subplot works beautifully as a mirror of his emotional state. It's a problem that he ignores, he lets it fester and refuses to properly confront it. And it puts his physical well-being at risk in the same way that he's putting his emotional well-being at risk. Tom's approach to life is established early on and consistently throughout the book. He's this laid-back guy. He takes people at face value and avoids probing too deeply into the actual motives or beliefs that might exist behind their words and actions. So, for example, when Miri wants to get a nose stud, he doesn't really care. He thinks, oh well, it's just that she wants to be like her friends. But Amy, his wife, is convinced that it's in aid of trying to hurt her, to get back at her for something, and she wants to stop it happening. So we get this dynamic of Tom being laid back and Amy overthinking and always going on the offensive in order to defend herself. For me, those personalities felt very real, and it made the decisions that the characters make and how they behaved ring true. But neither of those characters are very likeable, and if you're going to have any shot at enjoying this book, you do need to be okay with unlikable characters. Miri is also quite mean to her boyfriend and to her parents. They've also got a son, Michael, and he's someone who is very quick to encumber himself with family responsibility, which is admirable, but he completely distances himself from the family. He lives across the country in order to dodge that responsibility. And then back to Tom himself. He is a white man in his 50s who sometimes makes politically provocative remarks, often knowingly so. He uses the word transvestite. He says that he's glad his brother isn't fat anymore, and he's meeting up with an NBA player who wants to sue the league for discrimination against white players. Tom's involved in that because he's a law professor, though he is currently on like a extended leave because he's been asked to step back from teaching after a bit of controversy related to that. For me, that's what makes this book a really interesting exercise in empathy. We're in the head of someone whose lazy social conservatism might well rub up against our own views, but the longer we spend with him, the clearer it becomes that this isn't the centre of who he is. There's no big redemption arc or anything, but he learns things about himself. The book has been touted as a male version of All Fours by Miranda July, and actually I can see that, but I don't think it's the case that if you like one, you'll like the other, or if you dislike one, you'll dislike the other. Yes, both books are about middle-aged people who go on road trips that don't go to plan, reacting to whatever's in front of them while making sense of something in their lives. But the way these stories are told is shaped entirely by their protagonists. All Fours follows a chaotic artist who's a bit of a weirdo, and her decisions are wild and unpredictable. The rest of our lives moves with the more unhurried, slightly evasive pace of Tom himself. It's more laid back, less driven by conviction, sometimes even a little cowardly. The style, structure, and even the plot of these books feel like they could only belong to the person at the centre of each novel, and so they end up being quite different in really substantial ways. Overall, I very much enjoyed my time reading this novel. If Tom were my Uber driver, I don't think he'd quite get 5 stars, but I would have plenty of stories to tell about the ride. Next, I read Love Forms by Claire Adam. This is about Dawn, a white woman from Trinidad who, at 16, fell pregnant and gave up the child, and she made a pact with her family to act almost like it never happened. The novel takes place decades later, with her looking back on that decision after living a whole life, like an entirely different life from the one she might have had she kept the baby. She moved to London, she got married, she had kids, she's since got divorced, and through all of that, thoughts of the child she gave up never really left her. And eventually she starts to search for that child. She joins internet forums and she follows potential leads. One day, shortly after the story begins, a woman gets in touch that may well be her now 40-year-old daughter. And that might sound like that's going to be the central driving plot of the book, but it's actually much quieter than that. That storyline hums in the background. It's almost like when you leave your mobile phone on the table just at the edge of your vision and you might be willing it to ring with news. And so this potential of Dawn finding her daughter runs quietly underneath everything else, rather than being a big dramatic arc that drives the narrative. The book actually begins with Dawn looking back at a much earlier point in her life when she was pregnant, and she is secretly taken over the ocean from Trinidad to Venezuela and placed in a convent with other pregnant girls. Something that I really liked about this opening section of the book is that it's not written as a trauma story in terms of violence or abuse. She likes the nuns, she actually has fond memories of them, and she's treated well. But the experience, of course, leaves a deep mark on her life, and not least because she can't remember the specificities of it. There's so much truth in how she explores memories we have, feelings that we felt and maybe continue to feel, but which we perhaps can't reconcile with concrete knowledge or specific details, like perhaps we don't remember a name of a person or of a place, and we don't have any way to find out those things even if we wanted to. The consequences of that for Dawn and the closure that she's unable to get, of course, are much more severe than for the average person, but it's still something that I found deeply relatable. The writing here is tender and it's evocative. It captures the ache of possibility and the ways that we construct stories for the people we've lost. There's a part in the book where she imagines what her child's life might have been, and I found that really beautiful. And throughout there are also these lovely little resonances between different threads of the story that I noticed. Memory is a big theme of the book, how it's fuzzy, how we fill in the gaps, and I think that's really well handled. In the early parts of the book where she's looking back on her time in Venezuela, she stumbles over precision. She points out what might be wrong, where a name might not be quite right. Parts of her recollection might be missing. And that made it feel like someone was actually telling you a story rather than you were reading a novel sometimes. Place and belonging are also really important themes here. She visits Trinidad at one point in the book, and we see how cultural norms of a place can shift over time, and how those changes can often be shaped by broader economic and socio-political forces. There is one reasonably common complaint I've seen about this book from people who have read it, which is that it perhaps excessively explains cultural or linguistic nuances. For instance, it explains things that a Trinidadian person would just know. And one example of that is that it unpacks how the phrase "it's not easy" has a particular shade of meaning in Trinidad. So it's about Trinidadians, but it doesn't centre Trinidadians. It doesn't expect them to be the reader. But it also explains what a terraced house is, or how to pronounce the city of Derby, which are things that anyone in the UK would know. So it doesn't centre British readers either. And I found this really interesting in terms of how the book positions its reader. It makes me wonder who this story is written for. And I can't help but feel the book is almost an exercise in motherhood. It's explaining everything from the beginning to someone who is a blank slate, as you would with a child. The ending of this book is excellent. It's unresolved, but perfectly so. It resists some easy closure, which feels very true to the story and the way that life actually unfolds. So in the end, I really, really loved Love Forms. It has a quiet brilliance. It's a novel that lingers, not because of high drama, but because of the way it quietly reshapes how we might think about memory and belonging and the lives we might have lived. Really top stuff. Then I moved on to The South by Tash Aw. And this is a tender, atmospheric coming-of-age story set in rural Malaysia. We follow Jay, who is 16 and whose family moves to a farm in the south of the country, which has been inherited from his grandfather. The farm is run day to day by Fong, and when the family arrive, they also meet Fong's son, who helps out a lot on the farm, called Chuan. Jay quickly becomes fascinated by Chuan. He finds himself wanting to help out with farm work, and in the evening saying yes to riding into the city on a moped for dinner and drinks. And I think the novel really beautifully captures that teenage state of being wrapped up in someone when you reorient your whole life around them. You hang on every word they say or every shared moment, and maybe even start making these really unrealistic plans for your future based on just the glimmer of something. We actually know quite early on where this is heading because the book opens with a sex scene written in very poetic, beautiful prose between the two boys, and from there it rewinds to show how they got there. One thing I did like about how that was done actually was that we catch up to that moment about 2/3 of the way through the novel, I think, which leaves a lot of room to explore what happens afterwards, the emotional fallout, rather than just saving it all for the last page. All plays with perspective in quite interesting ways. There is a mixture of first and third person, mostly following Jay, but also shifting to his mother Sui and to Fong, telling a story that spans more than just one generation. And even in Jay's section, there is a shift between first and third person, but even in the third person sections, now and again the eye of the storyteller creeps in. It's as though he's both living in the moment and remembering it later, and it did make me wonder if the third person chapters were parts of the story that were too intense for the narrator to remember in the first person, which Jay wants to create a little bit of distance from. There was a similar thing in the book Margot's Got Money Troubles by Ruthie Thorpe that I thought worked extremely well in that book, and I think it works well here too, despite being a little bit more subtle. Here it gives the story a romanticised quality, layering foreboding over these tender moments. The structure is slightly non-linear as we jump about in time, but never in a confusing way, at least for me. As an example, we get the family's first arrival at the farm from a few different perspectives, but not one after the other. It's a scene we hop back to and repeat a few times amongst other events. The writing itself I found tender and vivid. It's quite poetic. I got a real sense of the hot stickiness of rural Malaysia, and the climate is an unavoidable presence in this book. Crop yields are falling, the orchards are diseased, and there's discussion of switching to hardier crops like pineapples. And that's a pragmatic solution. It's one that would keep the farm going, but it's also a little bit depressing because it represents the narrowing possibilities for smallholders and how monocropping can present itself as the only option. The novel also has these understated mysteries, like why the farm was left to Jay's mother when the grandfather who passed away is actually on his father's side of the family. I've seen some people say that this book feels incomplete because it's part of a planned quartet of novels. I didn't feel that. I think it does hint at a future beyond the back cover. Things like Jay saying, I thought this was important at the time, but later I realised it was one of many such moments. That is not a quote. I'm just ad-libbing. But things like that are said in the book. But lots of books that aren't series do that, because good characters should have rich lives that go beyond the confines of the page. For me, this very much stands alone as a satisfying, cohesive coming-of-age story, and one that I felt very moved by. Overall, I think The South is a really lovely novel. It's rich with atmosphere and deeply attuned to the intensity of first love. It left me satisfied, but also wanting to spend more time with its characters, which is good news for me because there are more books on the way. Finally, I'm going to review one of the novels that I had read before the longlist announcement, but which I haven't yet reviewed on the channel. And the one I've picked for this video is Universality by Natasha Brown. This is her second novel, and much like her debut, Assembly, it is short, but it is packed with ideas and some really clever storytelling. The book opens with a journalistic piece written in the style of a long read you might see in The Guardian or the New York Times, and it covers a really shocking event where a man is bludgeoned with a golden doubloon, much like the one depicted on the cover. And the article investigates what happened and why from multiple angles. But the story doesn't stop there, because what follows are additional perspectives that cast the first account in new light. So we get chapters from the perspective of the young journalist who wrote the article that has since gone viral, the man who owned the gold bar, and this controversial opinion writer whose son has been accused of the crime. And as we read, we begin to see that truth isn't singular. There are multiple versions, and each of those is shaped by the storyteller. What I found fascinating was how the book interrogates the form of this type of journalism itself. So just as great novels often feel true through small, resonant and specific details, the best journalism often has a novelistic quality, choices about what to emphasize, little moments that ripple across the story. Take the gold bar, for instance. Like, how does our impression of it and its owner shift depending on whether it's solid gold or just gold plated? Whether it's displayed on a mantelpiece or hidden away in a safe? How do we judge the owner differently if he's part of this inherited elite versus being someone who's a self-made businessman with working class origins? The book draws attention to these blurry boundaries between modalities of writing and how narrative shapes perception. You might be tempted to think this is a mystery to be solved. Who hit the man? Why did he do it? But that's not really the point of this book. There is no tidy resolution, and that's very deliberate. The real questions here are more philosophical. Where does power come from? How do words become powerful? And how does that power strengthen or wane depending on who is writing them? Who decides what is true, and does that authority shift depending on who is telling the story? Brown's wit in exploring this is sharp and unrelenting. Nobody is safe from her ribbing. I especially enjoyed a part in the opening article where the journalist visits the victim of the bludgeoning, who is convalescing at the anarchist commune that he founded. The members of the Universalists proclaim their commitment to diversity and freedom, to Black Lives Matter, and yet they are all white middle-class kids who almost wear a uniform of counterculturalism. They're not made out to be bad people necessarily, but Brown really captures that gap between stated ideals and reality beautifully, and uses it to speak to wider questions about society, privilege and perception. The novel feels distinctly British in its sensibility, so I'd be really interested to understand how it lands for non-British readers. And it's also a fascinating exercise in empathy. One character, Lenny, is this matriarchal opinion columnist. She is a contrarian who does the whole saying the unsayable thing, but is also very politically astute. She sees herself as sensing sentiment rather than shaping it. She's a political chameleon who might be infuriating if real, but on the page is really compelling and complex. I've seen some really mixed reception to this book, but I personally thought it was very smart, brave even in how it asks who we sympathise with and why, particularly in Britain today. The novel's very sharp, it's funny, it's consistently thought-provoking, and it's challenging too. I have to admit that throughout my reading of it, I was often wondering what worldview it was trying to endorse, who it was trying to criticise and who it was championing. But that's partly because I, like many of us, have fallen into this trap of every issue needing to have some underlying good versus bad dynamic. But reality is more complex, and everyone is under the microscope in this novel. Overall, Universality is excellent. It is a novel that entertains while exploring urgent questions about truth, power and perception. It's a book that will linger in your mind, and it will force you to think about how stories are told and how we make sense of the world around us. I know it's not for everyone, but it was definitely for me. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you listening to what I have to say about these books. I would love to hear from you down in the comments if you've read any of these and what you thought of them, or if there are any that you are especially excited for. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit like, because it really helps the channel out. And if you'd like to see more of my book reviews, then hit subscribe, and I release a new video about once a week. But until next time, toodles.